I never thought something like this could happen to me. It all started on a quiet, rainy Thursday morning in Savannah, Georgia. My husband Jerome was away on business, and I decided it was finally time to get the house cleaned up before the coastal rains came back. But just as I was rolling up my sleeves, my phone buzzed. It was my old friend Yvette. She was in town for just one day and wanted to meet for coffee. I hesitated. The house was a mess, but I hadn't seen her in years. So, I called a young woman from the neighborhood, Brianna. Sweet, polite, a college student trying to make ends meet. I told her where the spare key was, gave her instructions, and headed out for my coffee date. An hour later, my phone rang again. When I answered, her voice was trembling. "Ma'am, is there anyone else in the house?" I froze. "No, why?" And then she whispered, "Because there's a woman upstairs." I've always thought my house in Savannah was peaceful. Old, yes, with its creaky floors and tall windows that sighed whenever the wind passed through. But peaceful. That morning felt like any other. The air smelled faintly of salt from the coast, and the clouds hung low, promising rain later in the day. My husband, Jerome, had already left early for a meeting at his publisher's office. I was alone, sipping my second cup of coffee, when I decided the house desperately needed a good cleaning before the storm season rolled in. I could have done it myself. But that morning I got a surprise phone call from Yvette, my childhood best friend. She was in town, just for one day, and wanted to grab coffee before heading back to Atlanta. I hadn't seen her in over a decade. The moment I heard her voice, full of that same warm laughter from when we were little girls, I couldn't say no. The only problem was the house. It was a mess. Then I remembered Brianna, a young woman from the next street over. She was in her early 20s, polite, soft-spoken, and always looking for part-time work to pay her college tuition. I'd hired her once before to help with some light cleaning, and she did a wonderful job. So I called her, explained what I needed, and she happily agreed. Before leaving, I told her exactly what to do. Start with the study, then the staircase, and finally the upstairs hallway. Be careful around my husband's bookshelves, I warned her. They're old and dusty, and they collapse if you move them wrong. She laughed nervously and promised to be careful. I left a spare key under the mat, waved goodbye to the empty house, and drove off to meet Yvette at the Magnolia Tree Cafe downtown. The coffee shop sat under a massive oak tree draped in Spanish moss. It was one of those places that smelled like roasted beans and nostalgia. Yvette looked almost the same, just a few more laugh lines, a few gray strands. We talked for hours, catching up on everything: her kids, my husband's writing career, how quiet life had become lately. For the first time in weeks, I felt light, happy, until my phone rang. The screen flashed Brianna. I smiled, thinking she'd finished early, or maybe had a question about where something went. I answered cheerfully, "Hey, Brianna, everything okay?" But what I heard made my stomach drop. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Ma'am, is there anyone else in the house?" My hand froze mid. "No," I said slowly. "Why do you ask?" There was silence, except for her shaky breathing. Then she said it. "Because there's a woman upstairs." I felt every muscle in my body go rigid. My heart started pounding so hard it hurt. "What do you mean, a woman?" I demanded. "She's wearing a long white dress," Brianna whispered. "Her hair's all messy." I saw her walk down the hallway and into the last room. I thought maybe she was family, but you said no one else was home. I shot up from my chair. Yvette's face turned pale. "Brianna, listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Get out of the house. Right now. Lock the door and wait outside." She didn't argue. I heard the sound of hurried footsteps, then the slam of a door. I hung up and immediately dialed 911, stumbling out of the cafe. My voice was shaking so hard I could barely explain what was happening. "There's someone in my house," I told them. "A young woman I hired saw a stranger inside." I jumped into my car and sped home, barely noticing the red lights or the rain that had started to fall. Every second felt like an hour. My mind kept replaying her words, "A woman upstairs." When I finally turned onto my street, police lights flashed against the wet pavement. My heart nearly stopped. I parked so fast I didn't even close the door behind me. Brianna was sitting on the front steps, knees pulled to her chest, her face pale as chalk. "Are you okay?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She just nodded, trembling, unable to speak. 2 officers came out of the house, one older, one younger. The older one shook his head. "We searched every room, ma'am. Nobody's inside." No signs of a break-in either. I stared at him, confused. "But she saw someone. She spoke to me on the phone." He gave me that look the one people give when they think you're just overreacting. "Sometimes houses like these play tricks on the eyes," he said softly. "Old shadows, reflections in the glass." Jerome arrived shortly after, his expression calm, almost too calm. He put a comforting hand on Brianna's shoulder and smiled faintly. "You must have been tired, sweetheart. It happens." Something about his tone made my skin crawl. Because Brianna wasn't the kind of girl to imagine things. And deep down, I knew she had seen something real, something that was still up there. That night, even after everyone left and the house was quiet again, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still in the house, quietly watching from the second floor. For a few weeks after that day, I tried to tell myself it was over, that Brianna had simply imagined things. The police said they found nothing, and Jerome seemed so calm, so reasonable, that I almost convinced myself to move on. Almost. But something in that house had changed. It wasn't loud or obvious, it was subtle, like the air itself had grown heavier. At night, when everything was quiet, I started hearing things. At first, it was just a soft creak, the kind old houses make when they settle. Then came footsteps. Slow, measured steps above my head. The attic. I remember the first night clearly. I woke up around 2 a.m. Jerome was fast asleep beside me, snoring lightly. But I heard it, that faint, rhythmic sound. Step, pause, step, then a soft drag, like something heavy being moved. My heart thudded in my chest. I held my breath, listening. The sound went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was the wind, maybe a branch scraping the roof. I tried to believe it. The next morning, over breakfast, I mentioned it to Jerome. He didn't even look up from his newspaper. "It's probably Rat Simone. That attic's a paradise for them. I'll buy some traps." That night, he did. He came home with 2 large metal traps and placed them at the foot of the ladder leading up to the attic. "There," he said, dusting his hands. "Now you can sleep peacefully." For a while, I did. The noises stopped. But then, other things started to happen, smaller, stranger things. One morning, I opened the fridge and froze. A large piece of the spicy sausage I'd bought the day before was missing. It was sliced off unevenly, like someone had used a dull knife in a hurry. When I asked Jerome about it, he said casually, "Yeah, I tried some last night. Needed a little kick, you know." But that didn't make sense. Jerome hated spicy food. Even mild salsa made his eyes water. The next time I looked, the sausage was gone entirely. No wrapper, no plate, no trace. And when I checked the trash, it was empty. A few days later, something even stranger happened. Jerome and I had gone to Charleston to visit friends. We left early in the morning and didn't return until after dark. When I went upstairs to wash my face, the bathroom floor was soaked. The tiles were wet, water dripping down the shower walls, steam still clinging to the mirror. It looked exactly like someone had just taken a shower. "Jerome," I called out, "come here." He walked in, frowned at the puddles, and shrugged. Must have been the rain leaking in through the vent. I looked out the window. The street outside was bone dry. It didn't rain, I said quietly. He sighed, clearly annoyed. Then, maybe a pipe leak. Don't worry about it. I'll call a plumber tomorrow. He never did. For days after that, I kept checking the vent, the pipes, the ceiling. Everything was dry, perfect. But the unease stayed. Something wasn't right. The sounds, the missing food, the water, they all felt connected somehow. But I couldn't explain how. Then one afternoon, while Jerome was out, I decided to clean his study. It was a small room on the second floor, packed with books, drafts, and papers stacked everywhere, the kind of beautiful chaos only a writer could love. I dusted the shelves, wiped the desk, and started gathering the papers into neat piles. As I lifted a heavy stack of notes, a drawer underneath the desk suddenly popped open with a dry click. It startled me. That drawer had always been jammed shut, ever since we moved in. Inside was a small, brown leather notebook, old and worn, its corners frayed from age. It looked out of place among Jerome's pristine white pages and neatly typed manuscripts. Curious, I opened it. The handwriting inside was elegant looping letters, neat spacing, definitely not Jerome's. The words on the first page stopped me cold. They weren't diary entries. They were story ideas, outlines, character notes, descriptions of places and people. And as I flipped through the pages, I realized something horrifying. They were the same plots Jerome had used in his books. Every single one of them. My pulse quickened. I felt the room tilt. It didn't make sense. Jerome never wrote by hand. He hated it. He typed everything, even grocery lists. So who wrote this notebook? I sat there, staring at it, trying to breathe. Part of me wanted to confront him, demand an explanation. But another part, the quieter, more cautious part, told me not to, not yet. I slid the notebook back into the drawer, pushed it all the way in, and closed it quietly, as if I'd never seen it. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the house sounded louder. Every shadow on the ceiling seemed alive. And when I finally drifted off, I dreamed of footsteps above my head, soft, patient, and human. When I woke, the first thing I did was look toward the ceiling, half expecting to see dust falling from the attic door. It was closed, perfectly still, but somehow, I knew that whatever was up there, it hadn't gone away. After I found that old leather notebook, something inside me shifted. It was like a switch flipped. The house didn't just feel strange anymore. It felt alive. I started noticing the smallest things. The way Jerome avoided my eyes when I mentioned the attic, how he locked his study now, even when he just stepped out for coffee. I told myself I was overreacting, that I'd been living in my own head too long. But the truth is, I was scared. Then came the nights. Jerome had always been a night owl, but lately, he'd started disappearing from our bed around 10 or 11. He'd kiss my forehead and whisper, "The manuscript said a tough part, Simone. Don't wait up, okay?" At first, I believed him. But then I started waking up at odd hours, 1 in the morning, 2, and his side of the bed would be empty, the sheets cold. Sometimes I'd hear faint noises somewhere above the ceiling. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The clock on the nightstand read 1:17 a.m. The house was dead quiet, except for the soft ticking of the hallway clock. I reached out cold sheets. I whispered his name. Nothing. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold wood floor. The moonlight spilled through the hallway window, throwing silver streaks across the walls. When I reached the study, the door was closed. The light off, completely silent. "Jerome?" I called softly. No answer. I pushed the door open, empty. His laptop was off. His chair tucked neatly under the desk, like no one had used it all night. That's when I heard it, the faint creak of a step coming from above me, from the attic. My heart began to race. Then, soft footsteps on the stairs. I turned just in time to see Jerome coming down, barefoot, wearing his robe. In his hand was a porcelain dinner plate, our good china, the one we only used for guests. When he saw me standing there, his eyes widened in surprise, maybe even fear. The plate slipped from his hands, shattering on the floor. The crash echoed through the house, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I stared at the shards scattered across the wood. The plate was clean. No food, no crumbs. Just clean, like it had been carefully washed. "What were you doing up there?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I thought you were working in your study." He bent down to pick up the pieces slowly, too slowly, buying himself time. "I couldn't focus," he said finally. "I needed somewhere quiet to think. So I went upstairs. I got hungry, brought some food with me." I watched him gather the shards into his hands, his movements stiff and deliberate. When our fingers brushed, his skin was ice. Something about his calmness felt wrong, forced, almost rehearsed. He swept up the pieces, tossed them into the trash, and kissed my forehead. "You're too tense lately, Simone," he murmured. "You need rest. Promise me you'll sleep." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every sound in that house felt amplified, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the old pipes, the soft tick-tick-tick of the clock. But louder than all of it was the thought repeating in my head: he wasn't hungry. He was feeding someone. The next morning, Jerome was unusually quiet. He made coffee without a word, eyes fixed on the counter. When I tried to speak, he avoided my gaze. Finally, around noon, he came into the living room wearing a gray suit I didn't recognize. He was holding a small suitcase. "I need to go away for a few days," he said, flatly. "Maybe to Atlanta. I need inspiration." My stomach tightened. Jerome never left without planning. He hated surprises. "Why so suddenly?" I asked. He paused, looking at the window instead of me. "It just came to me this morning," he said. Then his tone changed deeper, more serious. He stepped closer, placed his hands on my shoulders, and looked me in the eyes. "While I'm gone, don't let anyone in. Not the neighbors. Not the mailman, and especially not anyone from the publishing house. If Sterling or his assistants come asking for me, tell them I'm away, and you don't know when I'll be back. Promise me." The pressure of his hands on my shoulders was firm, almost too firm. I nodded, speechless. 2 hours after he left, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a man in a dark suit and glasses, Mr. Sterling, Jerome's editor. Beside him stood a young woman holding a clipboard. I hesitated, Jerome's warning echoing in my head. But I couldn't just stand there like a fool. I opened the door. "Mrs. Whitlock," Mr. Sterling said sharply, "I know Jerome's here. We've called for days. The manuscript's 2 weeks late." I forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry, but Jerome's not home. He left for a short trip, for inspiration." Sterling laughed, cold and dry. "Inspiration? Funny, because your neighbor, Mr. Hamilton, says he sees the attic light on every single night." The words hit me like ice water. The attic light. I hadn't noticed it. We rarely even went up there. The switch was hidden behind an old cabinet. My mouth went dry. The young assistant stepped forward, her tone gentle. "Ma'am, if Jerome's struggling with writer's block, we can help. He doesn't have to isolate himself." But I wasn't listening anymore. My ears were ringing, my heart pounding. The attic light. The footsteps. The noises. The food. The water. The notebook. It all pointed to one place. By the time I closed the door, my hands were shaking. I pressed my back against the wood, eyes staring blankly at the staircase. Everything suddenly fit together. Every odd detail, every lie Jerome had told. There was someone up there. And I was done pretending not to know. That night, the house felt like it was holding its breath. I went to the shed and dragged out the old metal ladder we hadn't used in years. Its rungs covered in cobwebs and rust. If Jerome had hidden something or someone up there, I was going to find out. The house was silent that night. Not peaceful silent, the kind of silence that hums, that presses on your chest until you can hear your own heartbeat. Jerome was gone. And for the first time in months, I felt like the house wasn't pretending anymore. The wind outside had died, the rain clouds had cleared, and everything was still, except me. I moved through the dark hallway barefoot, the wooden floor cooled against my feet. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock downstairs, each second stretching longer than the last. I stopped at the base of the attic ladder. It had always been there, just a small square in the ceiling above the hallway. Barely noticeable. But now, it felt like a doorway to something I'd been avoiding all along. I dragged the old folding ladder from the shed. It was heavier than I remembered, its metal frame covered in cobwebs and dust. When I set it up beneath the hatch, my hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at that wooden door. The air smelled faintly of old paper and mildew. Then, with a deep breath, I reached up and pulled the latch. The hinge groaned. A wave of cold, damp air poured down, brushing my face like a sigh from another world. I turned on my phone's flashlight and climbed the steps, one by one. Each rung creaked, each breath felt louder than the last. When I reached the top, I hesitated. The attic was pitch black. The kind of darkness that feels thick, heavy enough to touch. I raised the light and swept it across the space. Boxers, old furniture covered with yellowed sheets. Cobwebs hanging like curtains. And then, I saw it. In the farthest corner, there was a small area that didn't belong. A wooden table, a chair with one broken leg, and next to it, an oil lamp, its weak flame still flickering. My chest tightened. Someone had been here. Recently. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I saw her. A woman, sitting at the table, hunched over a piece of paper. Her hair was long, gray, tangled falling over her shoulders like a veil. She wore a white dress, torn at the edges, yellowed with time. She was writing. The soft sound of a pencil scratching against paper filled the silence. "Hello," I whispered. My voice cracked. "Who's there?" The pencil stopped. The woman froze for a second, then slowly turned her head. The light from my phone caught her face, pale, thin, with hollow eyes that looked both familiar and broken. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. Because I knew that face, I dropped the flashlight. It hit the floor with a dull thud, the beam rolling across the wood. "Alana," I whispered. Oh my God, Alana. It was her. My sister. The sister who had disappeared 30 years ago without a trace. The one the police said was probably dead. The one I had grieved for, dreamed about, prayed for. She was here. In my attic. She blinked, her dry lips trembling. Her voice was rough, weak, as if she hadn't spoken to another soul in years. "Simone," she rasped. You're real." I couldn't breathe. Tears burned my eyes. I stumbled toward her, falling to my knees beside the table. She was so thin, her skin almost translucent. Her bones sharp beneath her clothes. Around her were piles of notebooks, stacks of handwritten pages, empty cans, and bottles of water. A dirty blanket in the corner, a small bucket. A life hidden away, surviving in silence. My hands were shaking as I touched her arm. "Oh God, Alana. What happened to you? Who did this to you?" She stared at me, eyes full of something I couldn't name. Sorrow, guilt, fear. "Jerome?" she whispered. "He said you knew. That you agreed." The words hit me like a knife. I shook my head violently. "No. I didn't know anything, Alana. I thought you were gone. dead. She looked at me for a long moment. Then her shoulders began to shake. Silent tears falling down her face. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of the oil lamp and the quiet sobbing of two sisters who had both been living ghosts. When I finally helped her stand, she could barely walk. Her legs were trembling, her breath shallow. "Come downstairs," I said softly. "Please, you're safe now." But as we reached the ladder, a memory flashed in my mind, Jerome's strange calmness. His cold hands, his warnings, the missing food, the wet floor. He hadn't been working upstairs. He had been keeping her alive, feeding her, hiding her, using her. The notebooks in her corner, I recognized the handwriting. They were full of story ideas, beautiful and haunting. The same stories that had made Jerome famous. Alana wasn't just his secret. She was his ghostwriter. When the police came later that night, they found evidence everywhere, hidden locks on the attic door, supplies tucked away, even medication prescribed under Jerome's name. I don't remember much of what happened next. The flashing lights, the questions, the pity in their eyes. What I do remember is sitting on the porch steps as dawn broke, holding a blanket around Alana's shoulders. The sun rose over the quiet street, and for the first time in years, I saw the house for what it really was, not a home, but a cage built out of lies. Jerome never came back. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint sounds above me, the creak of the floorboards, the scratch of a pencil. But I'm not afraid anymore, because now I know who's up there. And she's not a ghost. She's my sister. End of story.